Welcome everyone to the annual Grants to States State Program Report webinar. We've been doing this a few years now to help people get back into the swing of this system, which usually sees the most activity from October to December. And this year we have the added joy of having the CARES Act stimulus funds to report on in the system. So we wanted to be sure to cover some of the strange nuances that would come with that. And we, like I said earlier, are recording this session. And if you haven't already seen the slides, they are available on our website already. And we'll get the recording up as soon as we can. It might be a week or so. With that, I will turn it over to my colleague, Michelle Farrell, to get us started.
Hello, everyone. Today we are going to cover upcoming deadlines for reports, where to submit your LSTA report, and this year, how to enter not only your FY 2020 Grants to State Award information, but the CARES Act project information as well. We'll talk about entering your interim federal financial report for FY 2021 LSTA funds and the 2021 ARPA funds. And we'll highlight some of the best practices for reporting in the SPR. And lastly, how to bundle projects in the report. If you see that you can't meet the reporting deadline, you need to contact IMLS before to ask for a reporting extension. And as you can see, December 30th, your 2020 final financial status report and the narrative reports, including FY 2020 and the CARES Act, is due, as well as your 2021 interim federal financial report and FY 21 award and ARPA award are on that interim report. This is just a reminder that reports are due in the SPR, not in EGMS, because we know there's a lot of new people there, and that's the login. We've been working throughout the year on user enhancements, and here are a few of them. Now, when you are filling out the activity section, it will save each screen along the way. The SPR will now only let you choose one intent. So if you are carrying over a previous project, you need to pick one intent for that project. By April 2022, every grantee should have a Universal Entity Identifier, or UEI. It takes the place of your DUNS number, and the SPR will reflect that. There is also a button available now that you can choose if you're interested in joining the Community of Practice, COP. And as a reminder, we still use Wednesday evenings to push out new updates and to maintain the SPR. As you can see here, the light colored bar is the period of performance, and the block after that is the time you have to submit your report. The CARES Act award ran parallel with your FY 2020 award and ended September 30th. The ARPA award is running parallel with your FY 2021 award and won't end until September 30th of next year. So this year, you will have two financial reports due: the final financial report for FY 2020 award and CARES, and the interim financial report for your FY 2021 award and ARPA. You'll want to complete the project reports first, because the financial figures roll up into the financial status report. Here's what filling in the SPR will look like. Both your FY 2020 allotment and CARES will be reported in the same part of the SPR. To differentiate the CARES Act projects, you need to give them a title prefix of CARES Act, and then whatever your project is, as you can see in the box here. Note, none of the CARES projects should have a starting date before 4/21/2020. As much as possible, report CARES Act projects separately. However, if a project has combined federal funds from your FY 2020 and CARES Act, you won't be able to differentiate them, except in the budget narrative. As you can see from the example here, where the Wi-Fi extenders were paid for with CARES and the LSTA kicked in another $200. Also, match isn't required for CARES Act awards, but if you had subrecipients that had match funds, then feel free to report them here. You can use up to 4% of your allotment for administrative costs, and it will be a combination of both awards, your FY20 and CARES. Of course, it's your choice to choose to use any or all of that for the allowable 4%. As a reminder, the administrative project can include state or other match funds for administrative purposes, and this amount is not subject to the 4% cap. In the financial status report area for administrative costs, the allowed field is auto-calculated as 4% of both your FY20 and CARES Act award. The figures that you included in the administrative project will show up in the actual field here in the center. The difference will be auto-calculated. If you notice any incorrect calculations here in this section, we suggest you try saving the financial status report again. We're hoping that'll take care of it. To accommodate reporting the financials for both awards, begin by entering the two log numbers for your FY 2020 and CARES Act awards in the financial status report form. You can find these numbers in eGMS on the award document known as Notice of Action. The total federal funds authorized will autofill and represent a combination of your FY20 and your CARES Act allotments. As you can see here, those two figures going into the figure on the left. Note that the financial status report auto calculation for the minimum match requirement is only based on your LSTA allotment and does not include the CARES award, which is good news. And now I'm going to hand it over to Madison.
Thank you so much, Michelle. As we wrap up that section, does anyone have any questions about CARES Act reporting? You can put them in the chat, or if you'd like to unmute, that's fine too. All right, I don't see any questions coming through. You may continue to put questions in the chat along the way, so we'll go ahead and move on. So now I'm going to be talking about how to enter your interim FFR data for your FY 2021 allotment and the ARPA award. If the following slides look familiar, it is exactly how you reported your 2020 and CARES Act in your interim report last year. So here's a path to the interim federal financial report, which you will fill out for FY 2021 and ARPA combined. Pretty easy to get to. And as with your CARES Act and 20 reporting, we will need to have both grant numbers for both awards or both identifying numbers in the federal agency grant number field. You can find these numbers in Reach in your account, and you can also find them on your official award notification document. But they both need to be there, and they need to be separated by a comma or a semicolon or hash slash, whatever works for you. Now, we have adjusted the interim FFR in the SPR to appropriately reflect both FY21 and ARPA fields to the combined amount of both awards. But if you initially go into that interim FFR, you won't see that. So we ask that you go ahead and go into the FFR and then save it for those correct figures to auto-populate. You'll then want to fill out the federal share of expenditures field, and that will be how much you've expended for both awards combined. And then you'll have the total recipient share required field, which is the match field. This is auto-populated, but will only reflect the allotment match requirement. This is because there is no match requirement for ARPA. You can still report match on ARPA if you have some, but again, this is going to be the combined sum of your match for both ARPA and FY21. And for the, excuse me, we've all heard about the news switching from a DUNS number to the Unique Entity Identifier, or UEI. We have added we've adjusted the DUNS field in the state information page in the SPR to reflect the UEI. If you want the your UEI reflected now, you can go ahead and update it. You can find your new UEI in sam.gov, but for this year, we only require your DUNS number. You can have both this year if you want. Next year, beginning in April 2022, is when we will want everyone to up this field to the UEI only. Now, this is a reminder that for your reporting, you will not enter any ARPA narrative projects until the next year's SPR. And we know that ARPA was such a large infusion of money for everyone, and we greatly appreciate all the creative ways that you've come with spending your funds. But this is a reminder that we need to frame all ARPA spending as pandemic response as much as we can. If your subrecipients don't frame it as pandemic response, you might need to work into it in the SPR for them to have what next year's narrative report comes due. All right, do we have any questions around? I do believe we have a question in the chat. Let's see. Alice asks, if you use CARES money for the online portion of summer reading, so this is CARES Act reporting, for summer reading, and you already have a summer reading project with regular LSTA funds, would you still make a separate project for the summer reading, or would that be a case where you could combine them into one project? Great question. We are going to be covering bundling projects in a few minutes, which may be able to answer your question about whether or not to do two separate projects or bundle them. I don't know if my colleagues have any other initial responses to that one.
This is Terry, and I would say if online summer reading was one of the only things you did with CARES, you might want to have a separate project around it just so we can see that, you know, and it goes out in the public view that way and people can see the money was spent that way. But if you had a slate of 5 or 6 projects with CARES and that summer reading online tool was a very small amount of money, I could see a case where you just combine it with your LSTA existing project and make the differentiation in the budget, like Michelle showed earlier. So we're trying to be flexible, but we also want the good fruits of your labor to, you know, go out in the world. So to the degree you can sort of balance that, we're going to leave a lot of that discretion to you. But if you have questions or you want to bounce something off your program officer, they'd be happy to weigh in on approaches.
Thank you. And Mary asked, we would assume that CARES Act funds also need to be framed as pandemic response. You're absolutely right. CARES Act also needs to be framed as a response to the pandemic. All right, great. Well, I'm going to then pass it on to Laura.
Thank you, Madison. Well, this is the portion of the webinar that shifts from the new information related to CARES Act funds reporting and into a refresher and some general best practices for the SPR. I'm going to start this section by going over some first steps as a new user, as well as some suggested approaches for preparing your SPR report. And this is a slide that shows how you log in, and your IMLS program officer can help set you up in the system by creating an account for you. Your username is just your email address, and we will send you your password. You can change your password by going into the account management section of the SPR after you've logged in. And something to note is that Chrome and Firefox are the recommended browsers for this system. Issues with saving and editing can occur when you open two browser windows or tabs for the state program report at the same time, so it's best to avoid that. This often occurs when users want to look back at the prior year's report while completing the current year's. However, this can lead to editing and reporting bugs. And one of the first things you should do when logging into the SPR for the first time is update and verify your own information, as well as the information about your state library. All three of these options are in the account management menu. If your state library grants subawards, don't forget to maintain the subaward info section of the SPR. This section is separate from the project section of the SPR and provides information about subawards beyond just the ones that were funded. We also have some writing tips, in addition to plain language. Remember that the report is happening after the completion of activities and should be written in the past tense. The one exception to using names in the report is with outside consultants when it is acceptable to reference names. And again, we don't want just a program history or general description. You should think about the entire project. What did you do this year? It should reflect the budget and activities. You can take this information and put it in a brief paragraph, and do avoid bullets and pay attention to formatting when you copy and paste. And you can use the format stripping workaround to accommodate the SPR systems issue. And don't use colored ink. And with that, I will turn it over to Dennis.
Thank you, Laura. I'm going to cover some other elements of the SPR, certain things we look for in certain sections, and most particularly talking about approaches that you can take to bundling projects, which I know a lot of states with the CARES and the ARPA funds might be thinking about for the first time, either in a while or ever. So I'm happy to kind of provide some guidelines and principles in that area. So the first element we're going to discuss is statewide projects, and taking a moment to determine, is this a statewide project? Should this be considered a statewide project, or is this something that happened more at the local level? So these are some helpful tips as far as determining whether it was a statewide project. The biggest one being if the entire state's population were potential beneficiaries rather than a specific smaller target audience. And the statewide projects are usually administered by the State Library Administrative Agency. The easiest immediate example of a statewide project is statewide databases. That is kind of something that the state library often administers, and even if every single recipient library doesn't use the databases as robustly as others, it's still available to every library in the state. As far as bundling projects, here are some tips for kind of giving you a guidance on when it's appropriate to bundle or not. A big disclaimer with a lot of what I will be communicating is that these are general guidelines. These are very much a case-by-case situation. We've had a lot of state libraries already reach out to us with their specific scenarios to determine guidance on whether it's appropriate to bundle or not. So we fully anticipate having those kinds of one-on-one conversations sometimes, but these are some general principles to help kind of contextualize some things. So as you can see, you can think about individual projects, especially subgrants, that could be combined into a single project report if they support the same intent, if they cover the same subjects, they target similar beneficiaries, and when you bundle them, they're still with under that 10 activity limit within your project. So a lot of these are reporting principles, and some of these are also principles related to the way the SPR allows you to use the system. You have to really have some common ground with these projects, like they're sharing the same goal and they're sharing the same intent in order for them to even for it to be technically possible to bundle them together in the SPR. So here's a tangible example related to PPE recipients, because that was a popular thing to purchase with CARES funds. So we thought it would be a good example. So in this example, this scenario, there are 75 libraries that received PPE across the state. You can report that as a single activity because the PPE purchasing is all one activity type. And then you can indicate the 75 locales in the locale information. But there's also flexibility in how you indicate that as well. So what you would put, even if you were giving the PPE as several subgrants, the state library administrative agency would be listed as the grantee, because there has to be a single grantee in the SPR listed. And again, as I mentioned, you would have a single project, and in this case, a single activity, because the purchase was so uniform across all of your subrecipients. And then you have two options as far as identifying the subrecipient libraries. You can indicate that the activity was not statewide, and when you do that, the SPR gives you an institution kind of a data entry area where you can look up the institutions that we have in the back end of the SPR system and list them there. And that's extremely helpful from a kind of a data integrity standpoint, because then we have all of the kind of geographic information for each of the recipients, which is helpful often. But we also are trying to be flexible with the reporting burden that this could potentially put on you. So another option is to indicate that the activity is statewide, and then you can put the number of public libraries or other library types in the institution types as a number. So what we've also seen with recipients who do a lot of subgrants, especially the closest parallel I could see with PPE as opposed to what we normally would see from state libraries, would be collection development subgrants, because they tend to be, they're very detailed, they're very granular. And so we try to be flexible with the reporting burden that we put on the state libraries. And so we've seen various iterations of this. And then some state libraries, just in the interest of providing as much clarity and detail as possible, will sometimes upload the spreadsheets that they use to track the recipient libraries, maybe, the types of equipment that they received. And because they were already working on it and that was something that they were using internally, it doesn't put more burden on them, but then it gives me as the reviewer a really lot of helpful information. So that's one example. Again, I'm sure it doesn't cover all the spectrums of possibilities, but that's a way to see how the system works. Now here is, again, I'm not going to go over all of these in detail, but it displays the intents and the focal areas. We talked about how knowing when to bundle subgrants into one project is if they all share the same intent. And so you can see the intents laid out there in bullets, but the bullets are organized by one of the 6 focal areas that they fall under. So you see in bold to the right that lifelong learning has 2 different intents, information access has 2 different intents, and so forth and so on. So I won't go over these in detail, but again, this just gives you a sense of how the SPR is looking for you to organize your projects and how you can think about what would be best for bundling. And here's an example of 2 intents that have similar subjects underneath each project. So if you are really kind of torn between picking an intent, a particular intent, and you're thinking, oh, you know, this intent has this subject and I want to make sure I can report that, it would be good for you to look at the subjects that are underneath each of the intents, because you might find some similarities underneath of them that won't kind of get you hung up in one intent that you don't want to actually use. And another area that might help with bundling is to look at the crosswalk that you developed as part of your 5-year plan. Because if you had this project identified in your 5-year plan, there should be an intent aligned with it already. So you should be able to kind of just follow the lead of what was already in there. And if it's a new project that you didn't have as part of your plan, then again, we want to emphasize here that it should have just one intent. This is important for several reasons, but especially important when your outside consultant who's evaluating your 5-year plan, they're going to take each project and describe how it met a particular goal and intent within your 5-year plan. So it's a lot easier for them to just have a one-to-one relationship with project and intent. And activities, a good rule of thumb, again, these are definitely guiding principles and good rule of thumb kind of tips related to structuring your report. But if you're determining whether or not you should list some part of your project as a formal activity under that project, it should account for at least 10% of the total amount of resources committed to the project. So this could be that PPE example that we talked about. Obviously, that's a large amount of resources that were committed under the project. But you also don't forget about staff time can be quantified and considered at least 10% of the total amount of resources committed to a project. As we mentioned earlier, you want to make sure to keep the number of activities under 10. If you find that that's challenging to do, that might be a good indicator that you need to maybe think about unbundling from what you were considering, and maybe have 2 separate projects just for clarity and to really make sure that the activities for each project are kind of rising to the surface of being really critical and important piece to the story that your report is telling. And then we mentioned this a lot, but having a more of a holistic view of your SPR when you're reporting is that the activity title and the description under the activity, it should be distinct. So you shouldn't be spending a lot of time kind of copying and pasting what's in the whole project's abstract and putting it into the activity, because the abstract should be very top level. And then the activity title and description should be a little bit more detail about what was going on in that project. And that way it reads kind of not in a redundant way. And here's an example. Again, I'll briefly cover this because you'll have the PDF to review later to look at more detail. But the reason why this is a good example of an activity abstract, it briefly outlines what happened within that specific activity. It provides only the necessary info, but that info is distinct. And then you also see the activity and the mode selections in this screenshot, that it's an activity mode of instruction and consultation, which is great for these kinds of what you would say like drop in, exactly what it says in the activity mode, like drop in and informal instruction events and activities. Activities also prompt you to enter quantities after you finish this part of the narrative piece. Some examples of quantities is how long a program lasted in minutes, or in this example, how many consultations were conducted, how many books were purchased, etc. But sometimes we see as a common issue with activities is that an entire section is blank, completely filled with zeros. So you want to make sure that you're providing the numbers, at least in one of the fields, because sometimes you have multiple options. You don't have to fill every single field out, but making sure that at least one field has substantive numbers in it. And if you don't have those numbers, then maybe it's not the right mode for the activity that you're trying to report. So there are, here's speaking of activity types and their modes. Again, I won't read every single one of them, but when you select an activity type, that should generally follow the spending and the thrust of the project. I think for you, a lot of the states that have done this before may have seen some reports returned saying, I read this happening in the budget, but then I didn't see its kind of correlation in the activity. So that's what we're talking about. It's kind of, okay, I read about it up here, but what happened specifically with that money that they said was being spent? Where is it in the activities, that kind of thing. And you can report on multiple modes within a single activity. They can be bundled together, for example. And then this is a specific example, one that comes up a lot with LSTA funds, is if you have staff attending conferences, then the instruction other activity mode is a good use for that other mode. There are sometimes, as I just mentioned, you don't necessarily have the exact data that fits in certain modes, but other does have a useful place sometimes, depending on the type of activity. I'm going to spend a little more focused time on the procurement activity type because it's special and it has kind of specific components to it. It's used we've seen, and what we recommend is that it's used very sparingly. And you'll only see it as an option of an activity type to choose from if your project has an institutional capacity intent. So that's another thing where you kind of have to think about all of the pieces together. If you were planning on using procurement, then you have to make sure that the project that you're reporting has chosen an institutional capacity intent. And you can see on the slide, there's 3 institutional capacity intents that you can choose from. And those are the ones that are going to allow you to choose procurement. And we put in here, very specific to this year, a note that PPE could be an example of procurement if the intent is institutional capacity. You can use content acquisition, though, if the intent of the project is something other than an institutional capacity intent. So we really are trying to indicate here there's flexible options for how to report. We're trying to help you use the SPR to most effectively report and tell the story of what you did specifically in a unique way with your state. But here are some examples too of purchases that are not procurement activities and shouldn't be considered procurement activities. Purchasing databases is considered content acquisition, acquiring licenses. Purchasing laptops for a learning lab is an instruction activity, and subscription for data collection services is often content creation activity. So that's kind of a breakdown of procurement. There's always an asterisk with certain situations might not apply, but that's good general principles. And then finally, the activity outcomes section. We have outcomes reporting built into the SPR. And this is both at the activity and the project level. And an outcome as we define it is the effect of programs and services, something that changes an individual's life or the lives of the community. And it's a change in knowledge, attitudes, skills, behavior, or condition. And what we're trying to accomplish with these outcomes reports is to document what changed for participants due to the use of LSTA fund services or programs. And so you can see in this chart that there are, in the orange, these are the 4 instances when you would be expected to provide data related to outcomes. And again, this is all dependent on the activity mode and types and beneficiaries when you report in the SPR. So if you are wondering why, when you're reporting in the SPR and you've done an activity and there's a big orange outcomes button, it's because you've chosen one of these 4 avenues for your activity. And then if you're looking for it and it's grayed out, it's because it's in one of you've chosen activity modes and types that or beneficiaries that are in the the no area that wouldn't kind of light up the outcomes button. So, and this is just another reminder that we do every year. IMLS does not expect you to survey children. So activities that involve children don't have to have outcome figures. But you still might want to include in the overall project outcomes section, that's the narrative section towards the end of the SPR, some information on how many children participated, some things that you kind of anecdotally observed, but that's, but we don't expect this kind of strict data collection elements to be related to children. So with that, I am going to hand it over to Madison to talk about budget.
Thank you. We just have a few budget reminders. We're not going to touch extensively on the budget area, but wanted to have a few tips. When conference registrations are in the budget, it's best for them to go in services, not travel. If you purchase application software or any type of licenses, those are also services and not supplies. And then generally, we'd like you to avoid vague or misleading terms in your budget descriptions. So anything that's you write other or miscellaneous, we'd really like you to be more specific than that. And here we have some great examples for the salaries, wages, and benefits part of the budget. When filling out information for this budget category, please provide the position titles and the FTE equivalents. These two screenshots here provide great examples of budget descriptions. The first shows the differentiation between LSTA and state funds, how that salary is broken down. And then the second one shows how a single staff member salary is allocated across multiple projects. And remember, again, we don't need names here. We just need the position title. And now we have the other operational expenses category in the budget. This category is for indirect costs for the subrecipient only. If you, as the SLAA, have indirect costs, they should be represented in the administrative project. We have the top two examples. First, which were returned in projects because the charges described in those boxes aren't considered other or indirect costs. You can see how these two types of charges could be misperceived as other or charged. It doesn't really seem to fit obviously with any other budget box. But for the purpose of the SPR, however, the category is solely reserved for indirect costs. So for both of those instances, they would go better in that services budget category. The example at the bottom of the slide shows an example of how the category should be used. Indirect costs for subrecipients. The specific indirect cost rate percentage that was charged to the subrecipients grants is key and should be mentioned in the budget description. And again, if you have a project that combines multiple subawards, that bundling project with several subrecipients who are using indirect costs, it would be ideal to itemize those costs in that description box. Now we have our additional materials. Remember to upload additional materials if you have them. We have stabilized this part of the system from prior years. Sometimes people would upload things and they wouldn't save. Well, that problem has been resolved. So they should consistently be there every time you upload. We really love photos of your projects. So special shout out to folks who include photos, and we encourage that. But any additional materials you want to include that give us a better idea of the project, such as outreach materials, press releases, curricula, toolkits, website links are great, or sign up forms, anything that you would consider to be useful and provides more info on your project. Project tags. This helps us with national level analysis and could really be helpful for you as well. It's an open text field, not any controlled vocabulary. So you can put whatever terms you like and separate them by with commas. Then we have match-only projects, and some states do have a match-only project where the budget would have $0 for LSTA funds, and it would be solely on match funds reported. These are reported like regular projects with budget figures in the appropriate categories, and you will need to identify an intent for this, as well as at least one activity in this project. Now we're on to, once you have completed writing up your projects for your report, you'll need to change the product statuses from draft to completed. All projects have to be in that completed status for validation or certification. And an easy way to do that is in the list projects. There is an option for changing project statuses in bulk, just pictured here in the screenshot. Now, you will still have to open the administrative project separately in order to change its status. And here's a quick pathway to show you where to do that. We recommend opening and saving the FSR, the financial status report, at the very end once you've completed everything, because that FSR will automatically catch all of the financial information in your projects. So you'll want to do that last so it catches everything, and then resave it. And finally, we have certification. The SLAA chief needs to certify the SPR to fully complete it, and you can see the pathway here on how to do that. The LST coordinator can actually use the same sequence to validate the report. So if you want to validate it first, that will clue you into any potential error messages that may come up to prevent you from certification. But the first round of certification will be for the projects, the 2020 projects, the FSR, and the administrative projects. So all of those final reports. You'll select certify reports in the menu, and then certify again with the correct fiscal year in the dropdown. You can ensure the certification went through by checking the project status under list projects. They'll say certified, or you can look at the certification fields in the financial status report. Once it's certified, you'll see the name of the chief and the date stamp of when they did that. So the second part of the certification is for the interim FFR. You do have to certify that in a completely separate process, and we find that sometimes falls through the cracks. Again, the SLAA chief needs to certify it by going to the FSR, hitting on interim FFR, and then certify. And once again, you can ensure that the certification went through by looking at the certification fields at the very bottom of that FFR. You'll see the name of the chief and the date stamp. Final reminders, we do have a sandbox for the SPR, and it's available for practicing and training. There's the link there, and your regular login should work. If you have any issues with logging into that, let your program officer know. And again, reporting deadlines, they're all at the end of December, December 30th. Your final report will include all projects and the financial status report, and your interim federal financial report is for FY21 and ARPA. In addition to this SPR refresher that we do have additional resources available on our website that are part of the Grants to States manual. And you know that our proverbial door is always open. We're happy to answer questions from everyone. Here are all of our contact information if you need it. And now we are available for final questions. And I know a few came in.
Sounds like coming from the Chris's question and kind of Janet's also and Karen's question is more clarity on considering a project statewide or not. Whether if 50 libraries across the state, but not every library participated in a project is statewide. And this I would be happy for my colleagues to help clarify as well. But my impression is, you know, a statewide project is intended to be different than what I would consider like a subgranted project, a subgrant project. Those are the two. When we do data analysis in the past, we've had those buckets a lot. You know, this is a statewide project, or this is a project that involves subgrants. And so that's why the databases is always a good example of a statewide project, because whether or not a local library is using the databases, promoting them, et cetera, it is available to them. Whereas a competitive subaward process is technically available, but they have to apply and win the award to receive the funds, and the funds go right to them in a very tangible way. And that's my interpretation of that differentiation, but I am happy to have others talk about that too.
I think that conceptually is totally accurate. I'll get into the nitty-gritty of the system, which is just if you choose the statewide button, it's going to preclude you from dropping down and typing in individual institutions. So if you want to type in 25 of your institutions, and note that there is a type ahead autofill thing going on with that. So it's not like you're actually typing in the names and addresses of every single library. It's usually you type in the first word or so, and then the rest kind of fills itself in. So choosing the statewide button will sort of close down that option. So, you know, it may be a statewide project, but you just, you know, you want to list all those libraries, then don't check statewide.
I do see a question from Jody in California about discussing what would qualify as an activity. When we say 10% of resources for activity, are we talking about financial resources or if the activity took at least 10% of the time expended on the project? I would interpret that as at least 10% of the financial resources. So if it was like 10%, at least 10% of the total budget, then you would want to have a separate activity for that.
And time is money. So
time is
it
money.
kind of
Yes.
is also time is also a financial resource too. So it can kind of be both.
But the other thing I might say to that one, because it might not be clear, is if it's a smallish project, you know, a couple $1,000s, it may not be that you need to designate all 10 activities that were happening. I mean, we often just see smaller projects with 1 or maybe 2 activities total. So it's okay if you're not actually covering like all the flyer creation and all of the, you know, outreach and all of the partner work, you know, in separate designated chunks. I mean, we might want to see that for a very large multi-million-dollar project. And that's when we tend to see activities up in the like 10 range. But it's just a little bit of a rule of thumb. Like, what was the most prominent activity? If there was a second one, add it. If you had a really big project, we could see 10. But I think Madison's right. Follow the money.
Jamie from Arizona asked a question about outcome buttons lighting up even if the activity was targeted for children. I could be wrong. I don't think our SPR system is that sophisticated yet, unfortunately, Jamie. So if you find the activity is targeted for children and that outcome button is still lighting up, you don't need to fill it out. And hopefully the program officers will get it. But it is a really great upgrade suggestion.
Rachel asks if can libraries report staff time spent on the grant and paid locally as an in-kind match if they were not outside of their standard work hours. It's another one that I'm happy to get additional perspectives from, but my impression is what's important to us is just the time spent on the project, whether it's within their standard work hours or not. Just because if they were spending time on that project, then they weren't spending time on something else. So that is technically an in-kind contribution on behalf of their library to allow their staff to participate in the project. But happy to get that verified or vilified more.
I don't want to muddy the waters, but I'm thinking a little bit about the principle of allocability, which is that if you are a salaried employee, you're already getting 100% of your time paid. So I'm not sure that we'd want to see time over and above that being reported as in-kind match, just based on principles of good reg reporting kind of stuff. But if you have more nuance to that we're not getting, I mean, certainly send it to us and we can mull it over.
We have another question from Erica about bundling. Is there no longer a limit on project amounts can be bundled into 1 in 10? It used to be 5K or 10K. Yeah, yes, I can say that we used to have that as a general guideline for bundling projects. But especially with the dawn of CARES Act and ARPA, I think it's less of a matter of the amount of funds versus what are you doing? Like, what are the projects happening and how similar are they?
Yes, I would agree. I would say, I think the reason why, I mean, I could be wrong, but I think the reason why we haven't kind of said there's a moratorium on that rule and forget what you learned before is because this is such a unique influx of funds. And then, you know, once the stimulus funds are behind us and we're back to normal amounts of funds, it might still be a good rule of thumb when you're trying to figure out whether a project whether subgrants should be bundled or not. But it was never my impression. It wasn't my impression that it was ever a hard and fast rule. Like if we ever saw subgrants that were over 5,000, we would, you know, that were bundled, we would reject them altogether. It was more of a guidance on helping you figure out how to organize your subgrants and your projects.
Yeah, we'll just think of those bundles as bundles of joy in this season of big money and stimulus funds. Well, you all have been so attentive and we're close to the top of the hour. If you have additional questions, you can always send them to us offline. But I think for now, we will stop the recording and give you 5 minutes of your day back. And we will look forward to seeing you again in the future. Good luck with reporting.
Thank you. We appreciate your time.